Carl Benjamin is also known as Sargon of Akkad. He's the founder and co-host of Lotus Eaters, the host of Sargon of Akkad on YouTube, and he joins us now on The Will Cain Show. Thanks for being here, Carl.
Many thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Who is Sargon of Akkad?
He was an ancient Mesopotamian emperor that I used as I'm quite old. So back in the early days of the internet, you didn't use your real name online. And I just hadn't got out of the habit by the time I started a YouTube channel. And had I known that it was going to grow into anything significant, I would have just used my proper name.
Why was this ancient Mesopotamian leader your inspiration? Why Sargon of Akkad?
It's just a cool figure, to be honest, because he's the first proper emperor in history, and we don't know that much about him. But apparently he was very victorious, and so it was just something I found interesting. Really, no particular significance behind it.
Just the first emperor, not the last. I want to start with current events, Carl, if we could. I think it'll be a great window into a deeper conversation about what I don't think is a hyperbolic statement, the fall of Western civilization. I want to start, if you wouldn't mind, in Germany. A story out of Germany where a politician named Marie-Therese Kaiser of the Alternative for Germany party tweeted or posted on social media back in 2021 that Afghans in Germany feature particularly high levels of gang rape activity. Now, as part of this, Kaiser included data, government confirmed, government published data. This was a post in August 2021, where she linked to foreigners as misrepresented in half of all gang rape cases. For that, by the way, now she has been prosecuted. She's been fined $6,000 and will have a criminal record in Germany. Now, I think you can attest to this. No country, really, not just in Western civilization, but across the globe, holds free speech in quite the same esteem as the United States of America. Every other country seems to have embraced the idea of hate speech. But this is a shocking level of censorship and repressing prosecution of the cultural value of free speech, when one would think republishing government data would be something that would be culturally embraced as free speech.
One thing I think people in the English-speaking world don't realize is that free speech is actually a very Anglo value. Outside of the English-speaking world, it just isn't something that people generally support. And so we, as English speakers, take it as a given that, of course, it's our right to speak because it's our tongue in our head, and we have the God-given right to do that. But that's just not the case most other places in the world. And actually, the history of power dynamics is the history of repression and censorship of unpopular ideas because they threaten the status quo. And Germany is actually no different in that. The interesting thing in the modern era is actually this repression is being done in the name of liberalism. Because especially in the case of Germany there, if you point out that a particular kind of person has a particular propensity to commit crime on average higher than other groups, then what you're saying is that all people are not the same. And that's actually one of the core principles of liberalism, is that no, we are all the same, and we are all just blank slates, and we actually come from this hypothetical kind of abstract original man. And so if you point out, well, this group doesn't appear to be following that pattern, they're not the same as everyone else, then the whole superstructure that's been built on top of this assumption becomes suspect. And the questions then start getting raised. Okay, well, why are there loads of Afghans in Germany who have a higher propensity to commit sexual crimes, and on and on and on? And suddenly all of the decisions that have been made in the sort of latter half of the 20th century become suspect. And so I think it's just far easier for the German government to censor and prosecute, even if it makes no sense.
Yes. I also think there is the condition, the little devil that sits on the shoulder of humanity, that is not unique to the non-Anglo-speaking world. That devil exists within the soul of the Anglo world as well. That aspires to yell "shut up" at anything that they disagree with, at anything they dislike, and it makes me concerned. In the United States of America, there's two levels to this kind of embrace of free speech. There's literally the governmental lawful enforcement of it through the Constitution of the United States. But then there's also the cultural embrace. The idea that most people walking around America thought, yeah, even though I don't like what you have to say, I will defend to the death your right to say it. That has been completely lost. And I think that's we can see that in America with our neighbor, but you can see it in the rest of the Anglo world, meaning the UK, Canada, Australia, where there really is no culturally similar belief about free speech as is held in the United States.
Yeah, the United States is definitely unique in the fact that it has it codified into the Constitution. But I think you are right to point out that the real Constitution exists inscribed on the hearts of men. And if they don't believe the things that they ought to believe in that regard, then the very notion of it will just become eroded away through non-legal means, even if legally and technically they have that protection. We see this in the chilling effect of cancel culture now. Nothing illegal has been done when you're deleted from a social media platform or your bank account is taken away from you or something like that. These companies are actually well within their legal rights to refuse service if they want. It's just such it was such an unusual social norm that this just didn't occur. And so no legal protection was set up for this. And this actually happened recently in the United Kingdom with Nigel Farage, where his bank tried to shut him down for the fact that he wasn't woke. And the Conservative government, one of the few conservative things they actually have done, is to step in and say, well, hang on a second. To exist in modern society, people need bank accounts. Actually, maybe that shouldn't be allowed. And the bank has rolled that back. But the ever-looming spectre of that still hangs over all political discourse. At some point, institutions that we assumed were non-political can become engaged and become political and just roundly deplatform people, even if it's not the state persecuting you. So I think actually in the modern world, because of it's the speed of communication that's the problem, and really with social media is responsible for this, because it's very difficult to create such an amount of noise around a person that a company feels that they have to then take an action or else face a consumer boycott or something like that. This is something that's quite new, and I think it is the technology that's facilitated this. And I think the law actually needs to catch up on this one, because to exist in the modern world, you do have to have electronic bank accounts, credit cards. You have to be able to access the internet. You have to be able to communicate with other people. And this is just one of those cases where we need to be sensible and serious about this and saying, well, no, everyone has a right to participate in society, no matter how unpalatable their opinions might be.
Well, the reason that I focus, as you so eloquently put it, on the Constitution inscribed on the hearts of men, and the reason that I focused on the separation between the United States and the rest of the Anglo world, after you rightfully focused on the separation between the Anglo world and the rest of the world and how they see free speech, is that I see the UK and Canada and Australia as a bit of a canary in the coal mine for what could be and most likely will be coming to the United States of America. I don't think we're exempt, and I think our embrace of free speech is under great threat. But I look at what's happening, for example, in Canada, and this is another current event to draw your attention to, where they've introduced, the Trudeau administration has introduced the Online Harms Bill C-63. Many people are talking about this. Jordan Peterson has spoken out about it. On one hand, people are suggesting the most outrageous part of this is that it is retroactive. So if you at any point in your life have posted something hateful will remain undefined. But if you have posted something hateful and then it is published, quote unquote, published later by a retweet, if it's determined that you had the ability in the interim to delete that post, then you are going to be held responsible for the reposting of that. But others have pointed out, Carl, it's not the retrospective that's so nefarious. The Spectator wrote this up, and it was pointed out, if the courts believe you are likely to commit a quote-unquote hate crime or disseminate hate propaganda, again, not defined, you can be placed under house arrest and your ability to communicate with others restricted. So you can be held responsible, if this bill were to be adopted in Canada, for everything you've said in the past and everything you may say they suspect you may say in the future. We're moving beyond hate speech into hate thought.
Yeah, this isn't the first example of this either. Scotland also introduced a kind of hate crimes bill. I can't remember the exact name of the legislation off the top of my head, but it would allow the state to prosecute you for things that you said in your own living room. If somehow they were to gain knowledge of what you had said, possibly, I don't know, through your mobile phone, always listening to you or something like that. If an AI algorithm went through it and caught you saying something, or it could just be reported by a family member, you could face similar punishments. Not quite that extreme, but you could still be prosecuted and find yourself with a criminal record. I mean, this is the sort of thing that used to be the subject of 20th century dystopian fiction, but is now becoming 21st century technological reality. And again, it's one of those things where the technology is just getting so far ahead of what we're actually cognizant of, really the danger of. I mean, it always seemed ridiculous that there would be a telescreen in Winston's front room that would listen to and see everything that he was doing. But no, we're actually there now. Everyone's got an Amazon Alexa in their households. Well, I don't, but a lot of people do.
Well,
And
this device,
your
phone,
So, yeah,
to your point,
exactly. Your phone is listening. It's constantly listening. And it turns out that this wasn't a problem if there wasn't an executive managerial class of people who weren't prepared to take advantage of that, or at least if they were going to take advantage of it, they'd at least just be giving me tailored adverts on my Facebook feed or something. But when it comes to now, no, they're going to legislate your ability to think and say things out of existence and actively punish you for it, then it becomes a clear and present danger to the average citizen. And this kind of level of managerial control is really, it's unprecedented because they've never had this kind of access to the individual citizen before. And AI, especially, is going to allow them to be able to filter through the undoubtedly billions of conversations that they'll have to track in order to find the ones that they particularly hate. And this is just something that nobody really thought was going to become a reality, and yet here we are. So we as citizens should be taking this very, very seriously.
And the not insignificant detail that I offered in that setup of the Canadian law, that hate always remains undefined, increasingly, as illustrated in what happened in Germany, is hate can be defined as an accurate description of reality. What is happening in Germany? What is happening in the UK? What is happening in Ireland? What is happening in America? And so let's get to some of the substance of what is happening, at least in Europe. And I know in your estimation, at the hands of, or at least in part, at the hands of mass migration. Yeah, I saw this just in the last day or so, Carl. I saw that in England, less than 20% of Muslim adults are in full-time employment. Now, this is a stat from 2011, so we'll acknowledge that it's 15 years old. And it does include an age group that extends from 16 to 72. Now, it is also focused on full-time employment, not part-time employment. Now, all these things I'm qualifying, I think, are to be honest, perhaps, about the limitations on the value of the statistic, but they don't dismiss the value of the statistic. You could say that Muslims are disproportionately younger, so they would be disproportionately not full-time employed if they're 16, 17, 18 years old. And again, it could have changed over the last 15 years. But the overall British population at that time had a full-time employment of 35%, again, compared to 19.8%. What is going on when it comes to mass migration in the UK?
Mass migration in the UK was put upon the British people without their consent. At no point did any party run on a policy of increasing the amount of immigration into the United Kingdom, let alone increasing it to the extent that it has been done to us now. So in 1997, Tony Blair's new Labour government came in and, again, without the permission of the British public, decided to increase migration into the UK to a net of about 300,000 roughly a year for about 10 years. Now, that's for a country of what was in England, 55 million people. That was a massive amount. And in the succeeding time, Tony Blair left office, I think it was 2007, and the Labour Party left in 2009. And in 2010, we got the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, and then Conservative majorities up until this point. And immigration has only gone up in that time. In fact, it's become ridiculous. The Conservatives last year let in, I think it was 1.4 million new people into this country. And so the population of England now is somewhere around 70 million. It's hard to know exactly because there are a lot of people who are not simply captured on the census, because you can visit this country, and if you have large immigrant population areas, then people can illegally stay in them with friends, family members, and people that they know without the government being aware of it. For example, in 2011, one of the supermarket chains here pointed out that they think that they're feeding a country of about 80 million. So it could be there are many, many millions of people staying here that we just don't know about. And what this does is it really changes the nature of the country. When you have a relatively small, but ancient and settled culture, and you introduce lots of people who are just strangers to that culture, it's like putting a drop of water in oil. It changes things, and you see the oil moves away from the water because the people are just not familiar with one another. They just don't know how to expect the other people to act. And then when you bring in another million the next year, and then another million, and another million, this is the phenomenon of white flight. This is why it happens, because people are just not comfortable in their own towns and cities anymore. And so they are constantly fighting this losing battle to find somewhere they can just feel that things are expected and normal and predictable around them. And it's come to the point where even now quite small and rural towns have got a significant number of immigrants living in them. And you just think, well, when did we ask for this? This is something that's been done to us. And the argument is always made, well, this is for the economic benefits of it. But as you pointed out, if most of them aren't working, then they're not contributing to the economy. Not that I think that would be a justification anyway, but it fails on its own merits. Because actually, the government has done a study recently, and they think that in the next 10 years, they're going to have to raise taxes by £100 million. No, it was 100 million. I think it was £100 million in order to pay for the expenses that this excess immigration is costing. Because we have lots of social services. We have the National Health Service. We have various benefits services and social housing. And these are accessible to anyone who comes to the country. It wouldn't be so much of a problem, at least economically, if the national services that we had were national services. But actually, because we've got such porous borders, they've become international services. We get a lot of health tourism. We get a lot of people coming here, literally breaking into the country. And you'd think because we were an island, this would be rather difficult to do. But no, they just sail across the English Channel on dinghies now to claim our benefits. And so I get to pay for these random people who claim to be refugees. And they say, okay, well, where have they come from? And you get people like Albania. Okay, there's no war there. You've got a whole list of countries where there's just no war. The only refugees that we've taken that were legitimate are ones from Ukraine. And actually, we were happy to take them because they were actual refugees because Russia had invaded. But all of these other refugees, 90% single men, by the way, by the government's own figures, are clearly some kind of grifters who have come here just because we've got money. And they know it and we know it. And then, so when you go down to, say, the benefits office, you can see the people in there and, well, they're not natives. And so it's really, on every level, having a dramatic effect on our country, on a social level, an economic level, and on the level of sort of political morale as well. Because at no point do people actually feel themselves being represented until very recently. All of the top positions in the constituent nations of the United Kingdom were occupied by ethnic minorities. Now, that's not such a bad thing or anything like that. That's not something that I would normally complain about, except none of these people were elected to those positions. What would happen is a white British person was elected in a normal general election, and then they would do something that would get them deselected by their own party, and then their party would put up an ethnic minority person to fill that gap. Now, again, in isolation, that's not a bad thing. But then when the entire political upper stratum of the United Kingdom is filled by ethnic minorities, and you have left wingers constantly going, but representation matters, representation matters. Well, okay, it does matter then. So why is it that Britain has an unelected Indian prime minister? Why is it that Scotland has an unelected Pakistani prime minister? Why is it that Wales has an unelected African first minister? Why is it that the case? And so people not only are suffering from a kind of cultural malaise where they feel under massive demographic pressure, not only is the economy failing, so our high streets are just falling apart. It's abominable to see what's happening to the average British high street. But they also feel completely politically disenfranchised because they're not being ruled by people who are like them or the people that they even chose in the first place. Again, it's not a problem that they are ethnic minorities, but in isolation, in abstract. But the fact that they weren't elected and the fact that they don't represent the interests or seem to represent the interests of the common person, combined with all of these other factors, make us feel that we're just in a collapsing country and that things have got completely out of our control and we don't know what to do.
Well, you point out the effects of mass migration on the economy, on politics, on social cohesion, on crime. I want to focus for one more moment on economy. It's not just the UK. This is happening all across Europe. That last statistic I gave you, by the way, was from the 2011 census, is published in the Guardian. This here is from The Economist. This shows what's happening in Denmark, and this shows the net. This shows the net contribution, tax benefits versus tax contribution of various constituencies within Denmark. If you're of Danish origin, you contribute more than you take away from the government. And you can see here, if anyone's listening, several different lines on this graph. The one line that falls far below in terms of non-contributions fiscally, economically, to the government in terms of taxes and benefits received is what's called MENA PT. It's Middle Eastern and North African, Pakistan, and Turkey. And it shows that at no point in the lifespan of these immigrants do they become economic net assets to Denmark. But here's the thing, whether or not you're pointing out, Carl, the economic effect or you're pointing out the political effect, this conversation is always dismissed as racist or white supremacist or xenophobic or whatever ad hominem attack is made against it. But it seems to me it brushes past some obvious truths, and those truths are culture exists. Culture exists. There are distinct cultures. Cultures are not always of equal values. Cultures have their own unique values that are of more value to them than to other cultures. And when you, as you point out, start messing with the culture in terms of who here holds the same values that founded this society, who here holds the same values as what we've maintained for centuries in this society, then you are like arrogantly just shaking the snow globe of society. You have no idea what the outcome will be, and it's not good enough to yell racist when you're experimenting on society in such a foundational and fundamental way.
100%. And it's also incredibly disrespectful to suggest that any kind of people don't have the right to belong to a cultural group. Because, I mean, in eras before the one we're in now, this was just taken as a given that there were peoples, as in these were the Goths, these were the Franks, these were the Romans, and they have different kind of civilizations, they're different kind of cultures. Nietzsche had a great way of framing it. Each people has its own language of good and evil that the others don't really understand. And that's a fantastic way of framing it, because that's genuinely how things actually are in real life. Because the problem, I think, at the moment is the runaway dominance of liberalism as a philosophy. Because liberalism begins in a particular kind of thought experiment and actually doesn't really represent the world. It assumes that there was a kind of pre-social man who didn't have all of the morals, the cultural habits, the values, and the norms that come with being in a society. You know, the way that people say good morning to each other, or the way that people just tip, or something like that in the United States, whatever it is, all these small cultural accumulations that we carry with us over time. Well, they assume that those aren't a core part of what it is to be human. But the problem with that is that no one's born outside of a society. And so every single person is born and raised within a society and learns the language of good and evil that their own society has, whether they want to or not. You can't change that. Everyone is exactly the same. And the society you're born into, you carry with you everywhere you go. And this is really something that you notice in Britain because of accents. I've got quite a neutral Southern England accent. But if I came from anywhere else in England, people would hear it instantly. They would know my class status, the point of my origin, the kind of background I can be expected to have had. And it's the same for all other peoples everywhere else in the world. And so to suggest, well, we can just get everyone is actually not a product of our own civilizations, and we can just bring them in and expect them all to just get along in the social contract, then this is
right.
It's to say the peoples don't matter, the groups don't matter. It's to say that this isn't a real thing about what's looking, but it is. It is real.
It is so fundamentally patronizing, not just to the culture that you represent or I represent, but the culture that you're pretending to champion as well, because you're denying the existence, the fundamental foundational existence of civilization, the society, the way of life. And you just have to run the thought experiment in reverse. So I live in and I'm from Texas, Carl. You know, we have mass illegal and legal immigration in Texas, largely from the South, from Mexico or South America, right? And if you were to point out, well, there's a changing nature to Texas, then what are you, racist, you xenophobic? But if it went in reverse, I promise you, the Mexican culture would be like, why are you, no, this is not going to work for Mexico. We have our own distinct culture, and you're changing it. Or more obviously, if the immigration of the UK were to work in reverse, if you were to move to Saudi Arabia and say, and how about this thought experiment? The liberal and you fly your trans flag and you talk about all those values and you want to change that culture. How do you think that would be received? And so I don't know if it's unique to sort of the liberal ideology within Western culture, but it's not symmetrical. It's a denial of the existence of civilization and societies and ways of life, and it's asymmetrical. And I don't know the reason for that asymmetry other than self-loathing. Like, we hate our own culture. I mean, or just sheer ignorance.
I actually do think this is a feature of liberalism as a philosophy. And those places that are non-liberal obviously don't hold this philosophy. And you see it only where people are or have a commitment to liberal philosophy. You see it in Europe because after World War II, the liberal West won World War II on our side of the globe. In the East, you, of course, had communism. But it seems to be only the liberal West that really believes this. And I think it's because of the way that liberalism constructs itself philosophically, like I just explained, with the idea of the sort of pre-social man. And this is why in all of the times and in all the places, people are essentially just tribes. They are peoples. They have relationships with other peoples. And this is what the sort of national stereotypes are really about. And this is why they're useful as well, because it makes people predictable to one another. You know, I've traveled a lot around Europe. I lived in Germany for 8 years. The Germans just aren't like us. And when I say us, I mean the English-speaking peoples. It's not that they're bad. They're actually really nice people. They're really diligent. They're very polite. They pay their bills. They're never hostile to you when you're walking down the street or anything like that. But you can tell they're just not the same because they have strange cultural habits and they'll say strange things where you say, oh, I don't know why you would have said that. But they do because they're just not like us, and that's fine. You know, we have a cultural stereotype of them; they have a cultural stereotype of us, and it makes us familiar to one another. And so that's. I
mean, it's even real quick. Sorry to interrupt, Carl.
No,
it's even I'm sure, in your country, in mine. I mean, you know, I lived in the Northeast for a while. They're different than us down here in Texas, you know? And I know the provincialism of UK, you guys divide everything by family and region and accent and every which way.
Yeah, and I've traveled a lot around the US as well. And I tell you, man, I really enjoyed Texas because there's a sense of relaxation in Texas. And especially between like the races in the United States. I felt so much more racial tension in somewhere like New York or California than I did in Texas. In Texas, everyone was just really chilled out, whereas I could feel the tension in other places. And so, but this is the point, isn't it? It's to say that different peoples are different, and it's actually not helpful to not recognize that. And it actually really does have a detrimental effect on social cohesion and just society in general if you can't perceive that. But the liberal mind rejects that and literally, as you say, stigmatizes that as being racist. It's like, well, no, it's not really about race or anything like that. It's about lots of different things, but it's also about just accepting reality. It's reality as it really is, and as we all actually experience it. And everyone knows that it's true. We act as if it's true. You know, when an Algerian walks through the door, we don't act the same as when a Chinese man walks through the door. We know that they're from different places. Right. We know they have different cultural habits. I'm two random examples. You know, when a Mexican walks through the door, you have different expectations, and so we're just lying to ourselves if we say that this isn't the reality of the thing.
That seems the key to me. So, you know, the great idea of the United States of America, by the way, while Carl was talking, a shot popped up on our video feed of the Macklemore boys who are coming up in just a moment here on the Will Kane Show to talk about barbecue. It's the denial of reality, because the great experiment of the United States, Carl, was that it would be a melting pot. It wasn't a denial of an American culture. It was, we can take the best from every culture and we can make it something that creates this superior, you know. And by the way, when we say superior, it's not like that's the very essence of it. It's not racist. It's like we're like our own little venture capital company. We know we've got our core founders, we've got our core, yeah, and we're going to add to it. But when you pretend that none of that exists, there was no original culture, and there aren't pluses and minuses. And by the way, there are pluses to other cultures that are better. There are ways that other cultures are better than my culture, and there are ways that my culture is better than other cultures, right? And so when you measure it all out, you can make coherent decisions about what's best for society. But when you pretend none of it exists, and you just flood and say, oh, don't be, you know, we're all the same, no one knows where this will be headed. No one knows what this will do. But I saw some stuff. You do some good stuff. And the main thing you talked about that my takeaway in the end is we can talk about crime. We can talk about the economy. We can talk about politics. But the loss of a sense of social cohesion, that people can walk around feeling connected to one another, is the deepest. It's the deepest part of this. If we don't start acknowledging the existence of social cohesion, you don't have a society.
No, what you have is a social contract where you have who was it that described them as? I think it was John Locke who described them as a society of rational devils. As long as they're all rational, this society will work for a society of evil people, as long as they all follow the same rules. And it's like, okay, but then all I have at the end of that is a society of evil people. I don't actually want to be surrounded by a bunch of people who I think might be evil. I'd like to be surrounded by a bunch of people who I know are good, actually. And that requires us to know one another and not be strangers to one another and actually care. I mean, one phenomenon that's been remarkable on social media is instances of horrific crimes being committed to people on public transport and no one intervenes. Like there was an example in Philadelphia a few years ago of a woman who was raped by a man on the subway train and no one intervened. That's unthinkable in almost any other society that's not a social contract society. That's not a, well, the rules are this and I'm just going to do that. People would feel moral obligations, and I'm sure many people did. But there's this kind of attitude that comes with this social contract society. It's like, well, none of us know each other. We don't feel obliged to help each other. We don't have to be. We just have to follow the rules. And so basically, I don't have to pay any attention to you as long as you're not breaking this rule. And the worst part about that is when someone feels, you know what, I just don't care about the rule anymore, and they do something terrible, no one's prepared for it. You know, and so because you weren't allowed to have these expectations in advance, because of course that would make you a bigot of some kind. It's like, well, look, I'm sorry, man, but this is the reality of the thing. And we have to be able to deal with reality honestly.
Right.
And the question really the liberal should ask themselves is, why are you trying to deny reality? Why is your philosophy so divergent with what's really happening? And why are you okay with that? Why do you think that makes you a moral person? I think the moral person is the person who deals with what's happening in a just and righteous way, not the person who sits there with a prescription of rules that might totally be unreflective of what's happening on the ground and say, well, if you're not all doing this fantasy I have in my head, then you're all bad people. No, that's not how life works.
Wonderfully put. Carl Benjamin, you can check him out. It's Sargon of Akkad on YouTube, also the Lotus Eaters on YouTube. Fascinating conversation that hopefully will not be dismissed and hopefully definitely not regulated as hate speech when it's just, as we point out, attempting to understand reality. Carl, thanks for being on the Will Cain Show.